We'll get started in a moment. We're just giving people an opportunity to finish signing in.
On the screen.
All right, so we're going to get started, and then people can join them as they dial in. So thank you everyone for joining us for the Hebrew University Alumni Association's first Torch Talks webinar. The association seeks to reach and engage all Hebrew University of Jerusalem alumni in the United States to foster a lifelong connection to HU and to connect fellow alumni across the country. And there are many ways that you can get involved with us, from participating in future webinars to attending or hosting events and supporting the Alumni Annual Fund. To learn more, please email alumni@afhu.org. Following Professor Hazan's presentation, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. To do so, please submit your questions by typing into the Q&A chat box in the webinar. We're going to do our best to get to every question we can. I'm pleased to introduce Ambassador Miriam Sapiro, an HU alumna. Ambassador Sapiro is the Managing Director at Sard Verbinnen & Company and Vice Chairman at SVC Public Affairs. She focuses on public affairs and strategic communications, drawing on more than 25 years of experience. Ambassador Sapiro served in the administrations of President Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Obama, working at the State Department, the National Security Council, and the USTR. Upon confirmation as ambassador, she was Deputy U.S. Trade Representative and Acting U.S. Trade Representative. She served as a senior member of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and on the board of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Her previous government experience includes working in the White House as Special Assistant and Counselor to the President and as Director of European Affairs at the National Security Council. She also served as a member of the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff and worked in the Office of the Legal Advisor, where she helped negotiate the Dayton Peace Accords that ended the war in Bosnia. She is the recipient of 2 Superior Honor Awards from the Department of State. Ambassador, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Miriam. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for organizing these webinars. I'm very proud to be an alumna of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which, as all of you on the call know, one of the world's most distinguished academic and research institutions. The Hebrew University's spirit of academic and research innovation is evident in the advances its faculty and its students achieve, from new cancer treatment options to expanding global food supplies to creating a safer internet and to examining geopolitical issues and Israeli issues, as we will do today. It's truly an honor to be able to introduce Hebrew University's Professor Reuven Hazan to discuss the upcoming Israeli elections on the 9th of April. Professor Hazan is a chair in Israeli democracy and politics and the former chair of the Department of Political Science, where he still teaches. I'm truly sorry, Professor, that I was not a student at Hebrew University when you were teaching. His expertise focuses on the historical and current analysis of democratic institutions, and he was closely involved in reforming Israel's electoral system. He continues to advise Israeli politicians on the restructuring of the legislative branch, collaborates with think tanks, serves as a consultant for several political parties, and is often called upon to testify before the Knesset. And he's also served on the Presidential Commission on the Structure of Government in Israel. In addition to that, he's a frequent commentator on CNN, Fox, BBC, NPR, and other networks, as well as has published in Time, Newsweek, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and countless other publications, always providing keen insights into the latest developments in Israeli politics. So we're very excited to hear what you have to say today, especially given the developments of just this past week. Professor Hazan, the screen is yours.
Good morning. I'm in wonderful Los Angeles, which is a beautiful place to be, having spent this past week in places like Chicago. So I'm thrilled to be on the West Coast and enjoying the weather. I hope everyone can hear me. I hope everyone can see the presentation. This is a little daunting because I usually like to look into the faces of the people I'm speaking to and realize if they're still there with me. So I am just going to push on ahead and try in less than 15 minutes to explain the rather complex political system in Israel. And as I do so, I have to be an educator. I can't jump into exactly what is happening right now. We need some background. So let's start with the background. I'm trying to see if I can get the presentation going here. It isn't moving, so I'm going to need a little bit of help here on my end. All right. I hope that this will work. I want to contrast the presidential system that you have in the United States with the one we have in Israel. Now, presidential democracies are in existence in many countries, such as the United States, such as Mexico, such as Argentina and Brazil. In every country, it is a different form of democracy, but basically they share two characteristics. The first is that the voters vote separately for the two branches of government. You elect the president, which is the executive branch, separately from Congress, which is the legislative branch, and the two are not only elected separately, they survive separately. They have fixed terms of office. The president picks the entire cabinet. They are, as that famous Woodward and Bernstein book, all the president's men. They serve at the whim of the directly and separately elected president. In other words, we're talking about a separation of powers system. If you take this and turn it upside down, you get a parliamentary democracy, which started in Britain, exists in countries like Canada, Germany, and of course, Israel. By the way, a majority of the democracies in the world are parliamentary, not presidential. In a parliamentary democracy, and what we will be doing on April 9th, as the ambassador said, is Israeli voters will get only one vote, not two. We do not elect the executive and the legislative branch separately. We elect only one, the legislative branch. And out of the legislative branch emerges the cabinet, the government. In other words, in a parliamentary system, the government is based on a majority in the legislative branch. This is not a presidential system where legislature and executive are separate. In a parliamentary system, they are fused, they are together. Government is the government because it has a majority in the legislative branch. And the interesting thing is that if it loses that majority on any given day during its term of office, the legislature can have a vote of no confidence and bring down the government. So while in a presidential system, the two branches are elected separately, survive separately, and elections are on a fixed date, in a parliamentary system, one branch is elected, the other emerges from it and is responsible to it. So it can be brought down and early elections can be called at any time. This is not better or worse, it is simply different. And to understand that in a parliamentary system, the government is based on a majority, and that majority can remove the government from office and call for early elections is not necessarily a sign of instability, it could be a sign of adaptability. It is simply a different way of looking at how the democratic system should function. In other words, if it is not a separation of powers, it is a complete fusion of powers. Now, if we move to the elections, in the United States, there are three things in the election process that are non-existent in Israel. The first thing is that it is a personal election. There is a name on the ballot, and that is critical because it creates two players in the American political system. There is the organized political party, and there is the individual candidate. And at times, most of my colleagues who write about politics in the United States have said that the individual candidate has become more powerful than the organized political party. And I guess the best example of that is the recent election of Donald Trump. You also have districts. For those of you unfamiliar with this map, this is the 435 congressional districts in the United States. So in the US, an individual candidate is running in a district, and the election is a winner-take-all majoritarian or plurality election. And that makes things very simple. One person will win. In order to vote and to have your vote count, you need to vote for someone who can win or the second-placed candidate in order to defeat the front-runner. But voting for a third-placed candidate is throwing your vote away in the United States. You cannot hope to win. Take all of this and turn it upside down. This is a voting booth in Israel. What you see here are two things. First of all, a whole bunch of political parties. We have many that run. And second, these are political parties. For those of you Hebrew University alumni who remember a little bit of Hebrew, these letters are acronyms of the political parties. The one that you see at the bottom that stands out the most, the two Hebrew letters of Shin and Samech, Shas, is the ultra-Orthodox Sephardi party. When we vote in Israel, we do not vote for a person. We vote for a party, and behind each party label is a long list of candidates that, based on how many seats the party will get, we go down that list and realize how many candidates they will put in office. We also have no districts. The entire state of Israel is one nationwide voting district. Now, if you're voting for a party and you're voting across the entire country, you cannot have a plurality, a winner-take-all election, and what we have is the opposite. It's a proportional election. Proportional means that whatever percentage of the national vote a party receives, that is exactly the percentage of seats that they will get. So unlike in American elections where in order to have your vote count, you have to vote for someone who can win, in an Israeli election, in order to have your vote count, you can vote for practically any party. If the party is running first or second, it doesn't matter. It could be running third or fourth or eighth or 10th. If the party gets 10% of the vote across the entire country, it will get 10% of the seats, which means voting for parties that are not running at the top of the polls is still not throwing your vote away. Your party will get seats. And when you have to put together that majority government, because I just said we're a parliamentary system, smaller parties might be necessary in order to form that majority, which means voting for a small party, first of all, your vote counts, and second of all, you can have an impact on politics. Let's also focus for a minute on the issues in Israeli politics, because in the United States, when I follow the elections here, I see you talk about the wall a lot. We could give you some advice on how to build a wall. You talk about taxes. You talk about healthcare. These are not the issues that drive an election in Israel. We do not focus on domestic issues. We focus on foreign policy. In Israel, the number one issue is the fact that the country is just so small, and that we have neighbors who not only refuse to recognize our right to exist, but are bent on our destruction. Iran, for example, you can see is so much larger than Israel and already possesses missile technology that can cover all of Israel. We just have to hope that their nuclear program doesn't develop enough so that they can place nuclear bombs into their already existing delivery mechanisms and be able to destroy Israel, which they remind us every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday is their goal. In other words, when we talk about Israeli politics, we're talking about security. We're not talking about right and left based on economic issues. We're talking about hawks and doves based on security issues. And that is the perspective you should take when assessing the Israeli political system. The more you are on the right, the more you are hawkish. You want to hold on to land. You believe that the Arabs cannot be trusted. You want to build more settlements. The more you are on the left, the more you believe the Palestinians have a right to self-determination, that it is immoral for Israel to hold on to land that it captured during warfare, and that we should negotiate a land for peace agreement. Notice I'm not talking about taxes or healthcare or any of the issues that divide politicians in the United States. This is a headline from the #1 economic newspaper in Israel called The Marker from earlier this month before I left Israel. And it says in clear letters what you should know in order to follow an Israeli election campaign. You cannot win the elections if you're focusing on an economic agenda. This is the opposite of what it is in the United States. If I can go back and quote, I think it was James Carville, who was the assistant to Bill Clinton, when he said, "It's the economy, stupid." Well, in Israel, the headline should be, "It's not the economy, stupid." How do you win an election in Israel? Look at this picture. This is a picture of a huge billboard in downtown Tel Aviv, the main highway that goes through Tel Aviv, the biggest traffic jam every morning and evening in Tel Aviv. I'd like you to focus on two things. First, look at the buildings next to it, at how tall this billboard is. It is many, many stories high. And as you notice, it is Netanyahu and Trump, because in order to head your election campaign, you focus on foreign affairs and you tell the voters, I am friends with the #1 country in the world today, and if you elect me, I can take care of Israel's security. Again, for those of you who read Hebrew, look at the bottom of the poster. It says Likud, reminding everyone that Netanyahu is not on the ballot. You have to vote for the Likud party. So what I've said so far are the items in red. You're a presidential democracy, we're parliamentary, you focus on individual candidates, we have only parties that run, you have districts, we have no districts, yours is a winner-take-all elections, ours is proportional, you focus on domestic issues, we focus on security. If I had more time, I would talk about the fact that you're a federal country, we have no states, we are one centralized country. You have 2 chambers in the legislature, we have only 1. You have a constitution, we don't. You can spend as much as you want on campaign funding. We limit it tremendously, and therefore it is the state, the country, that funds the political parties. Your Supreme Court is a political appointment process. Ours is completely non-political, and on and on. I think I've gotten my message across. These are 2 very, very different political systems, and the last thing you should do is try to understand the elections in Israel because you have a good working knowledge of the American political system. I would suggest that you leave American politics behind if you want to understand Israel. Let's jump into Israel in the few minutes I have left. These are the election results of the 2 top parties in Israel for all 20 elections we've held so far, from the first in 1949 up until the last elections in 2015. You will notice 3 periods over time. The first is up to the mid-70s, where one party, the party in blue, which is the largest party, is way ahead of the party in red, which is the second largest party. That gap shows you that one party basically won the elections and the other didn't give it much of a race. Then from the late 1970s, you see that the gap disappears and the 2 big parties are neck and neck. We have a horse race in Israeli politics and elections become very close. And then from the 1990s, you see that both of the parties are still quite close, but declining overall. In other words, the Israeli voters who in the 70s and 80s gave maybe 4 out of 5 votes to the 2 big parties are now giving them a lot less, which means the smaller parties in Israel are gaining more and more seats. I do want you to notice that the top line is at 60. The Israeli parliament has 120 seats, which means in order to form a majority, because we're a parliamentary system, you need at least 61. And you'll notice that no party in Israel has ever crossed that threshold. We have never had a party that has been able to govern alone. We always needed additional parties in order to form a majority coalition. And this is why it's so important to understand that the 3rd period of the last 20 years, in which the biggest parties have declined, it has made forming that government after an election an increasingly more difficult task, and keeping that government together for the full 4 years so that parliament does not have a vote of no confidence, that task has become even more difficult. So my prime minister is not elected separately like a president. He simply leads the largest party. That party is not so large anymore. Many, many partners are necessary in order to form that majority, and keeping that majority together consumes a lot of the prime minister's time. He's not free to govern. He's focusing on political survival. This is the election results of 4 years ago. What you see here are the 10 parties that made it into the Israeli parliament. And if you can see the different colors, this is how Israeli voters think. We think in blocks, in groups, in party families. Most Israeli voters, and by that I mean about 80%, move between parties, but they do not move between blocks. So for example, the blue bloc, which is the Likud, the Jewish Home, and Israel Our Home, are the three hawkish, the more right-wing parties. Voters move between them, but they will not leave that camp. The two red parties, the Zionist Union, which is the Labour Party, and Meretz are the dovish left-wing parties. We have an Israeli Arab Party, which is the joint list in green. Israeli Arabs make up close to 20% of the Israeli population, and they have the third largest party in the Israeli parliament. We have two ultra-Orthodox, very religious parties, that is Shas and United Torah Judaism. And then we have two parties that I put them in purple because that's simply a mix of red and blue, because they're in the center. They're not hawkish, they're not dovish, they're somewhere between the two main blocks, which are the blue parties, the hawks on the right, and the red parties, the doves on the left. If you can digest this, then hopefully this will make it even simpler. This is a diagram based on 3 dimensions. Security is the right to left dimension. The more you're on the right, the more hawkish you are. The more you're on the left, the more dovish. Religion is the y-axis, the up and down dimension. The more you are on top, the more religious, orthodox the party is. The more you are on bottom, the more secular. And size is the 3rd dimension. The bigger the circle, the more seats the party has in the parliament. What you see here are the 3 parties that are in the hawkish blue camp to the right, the 2 parties that are in the dovish left camp to the left, the Israeli Arab Party, which is the extreme left, the 2 ultra-religious parties, which are way on top, focusing overwhelmingly on religious issues, and the 2 purple parties who are the center between the blue and the red. If you look at this, you understand how we put governments together. So for example, in the last elections, the Likud party was larger than any other party. Its natural partners, the Jewish Home and Israel Our Home, came to Likud and tried to form a government. They didn't have enough seats, so they had to reach out and bring in additional parties. The closest group to the 3 blue parties are the 2 black ones, the ultra-Orthodox. They brought those in. They were still short of a majority. They needed 1 more party, and the closest party to these 5 is Kulanu, the party that's in purple in the middle. With Kulanu, they had a majority, and that has been the government of the last 4 years. So if you understand the importance of the security dimension, the fact that religion comes in next in Israel, not the economy, the size of the parties in a proportional parliamentary system, you can begin to get your head around how governments are formed in Israel. Let's move to the current elections. This is the breakdown of the 5 blocks that I just showed you in the previous chart. After the 2015 elections, you see the 3 hawkish parties, the 2 religious parties. Together at bottom, they have only 57, which was short of the 61 majority. They added Kulanu, which had 10 seats, and there you had the majority for the last 4 years. What has changed from then to the polls now? Pay attention to the hawkish camp. A new party has established itself in the hawkish camp. So essentially, we have 4 parties there. This is the party called the New Right. Those of you who follow Israeli politics, this is Naftali Bennett, who broke off from the Jewish Home. But what you see is that the hawkish camp basically has the same number of seats altogether. They had 44 before, they have 46 now. This is more or less the same. The religious parties had 13 in the last elections, they now have 12. So the hawkish religious camp has moved from 57 to 58 seats altogether. In other words, nothing. This is statistical error based on the polls. The Arab parties also at about 13 seats, nothing has changed. The main change in Israeli politics is in the dovish camp. The Labour Party had 24 seats in the last elections. They are in free fall. They have lost 2/3 of their voters according to the polls. In other words, from 24 down to 8, that's a loss of 16 seats. And the question is, where did those 16 seats go to? And they went to a new party in the center called Blue and White, which is based on two groups. A party we had in the last elections called Yesh Atid that won 11 seats, plus the new party established by the former chief of staff in Israel, Benny Gantz, and all the voters from Labor that dished Labor and moved to this new party. So now, according to the polls, this party is ahead. They are actually ahead of Likud in the polls back in Israel. Does that mean that Benny Gantz is going to be the next prime minister in Israel? No, because this is not an American election. We're not looking at who won the most votes. We're looking at the ability to form a majority coalition in the Israeli parliament. Look at the hawkish and religious parties. They are at 58. They need 3 more to form a government. Kulanu was in the previous government with them. Kulanu is down in the polls, but still at about 3 to 4 seats. In other words, the outgoing government still has a majority to be re-elected in Israel on April 9th. The fact that Blue and White will be the largest party doesn't mean that they have enough partners in order to form a majority government and remove Netanyahu from power. But let me end by saying that these are the polls now. We are 42 days away from the election. For anyone who has done any work in politics, 42 days is a lifetime. And in the middle of those 42 days, you will read about it in every major newspaper in the United States. The Attorney General of Israel will make a decision on whether he's going to indict Prime Minister Netanyahu for bribery charges. This is supposed to happen any day now. When that decision is made, that will be throwing a bomb into the middle of the election campaign, which means there's only one thing I can promise you. These polling numbers will not be the same 42 days from now. We'll have to see what the results are. We'll have to see not who came in first, but who can form a majority in order to establish the next government in Israel. Thank you very much, and I end with a couple of pictures of the campus where I teach at the Hebrew University.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Hazan. So now we're going to move into the question and answer portion. The first we have is actually a couple around a similar topic about Netanyahu's new alliance with Otzma Yehudit. And so people are asking, why does it seem like the left-wing parties are self-destructing rather than strengthening? And if you think they'll be able to recover. And then additionally, what does Netanyahu's new alliance with Otzma Yehudit mean?
Okay, this is, I think, rather simple. When you look at the dovish camp, you realize what I explained, that elections in Israel are not about social or economic issues, they're about security. And the Labour Party has hitched its entire campaign for the last 25 years, since Yitzhak Rabin, on the Oslo Accords and the peace process with the Palestinians. Most voters in Israel today do not believe that that is a viable alternative today. The Palestinians are divided into 2 camps. Hamas doesn't recognize our right to exist. The Palestinian Authority is inept, corrupt, and does not or cannot reach an agreement with Israel. The rest of the Middle East is not in a good situation. The civil war in Syria, Hezbollah, Erdogan in Turkey, the military coup in Egypt a few years ago, In other words, Israelis today do not feel that there is a peace partner or a peace process, and they are moving away from the party that talks about let's take a leap of faith, let's sign a land for peace agreement, and let's hope that things get better. Most Israelis think that that will simply bring the conflict closer to us. So this is the reason that the left is hemorrhaging, but the voters on the left cannot move to the hawks to the right. So they're moving to the center because while they're dismayed with the peace process, they still have not become right-wing hawks wanting to build more settlements and thinking that we have to live by the sword forever. What does this have to do with Netanyahu's agreement and support for the extreme right party, which is now part of the Jewish home? Again, look at the numbers. The last thing Netanyahu wants is that one of the smaller parties in the hawkish camp will fall so far down that if they get less than 3 or 4 seats, they won't even get into the parliament. And then with the numbers of the hawkish parties, plus the religious parties, plus Kulanu, they will still not be at 61. And when that happens, then the fact that blue and white is running ahead in the polls, they might be able to convince some of those parties to join them and form a government. So what Netanyahu did, and I don't agree with what he did, but it's a political survival move, is try not to lose votes on the hawkish right because of the splintering of the smaller parties. In the past, when this happened, the hawks have lost the elections. He doesn't want to repeat that mistake.
Great. The next question comes in. It says, about 20 years ago, Israel briefly switched to a system in which the prime minister was elected separately. Why was the switch made? Why the switch back? And what lessons were learned?
This is an entire lecture, if not an entire course. So I'm not going to be able to answer that, and I'm doing a disservice by answering it in less than a minute. What we tried to do in the 1990s is to convince people to vote for the larger parties. So we had a separate election for the prime minister, almost like a presidential election here, hoping we would get a coattails effect. A popular candidate would swing votes for the party as well. But we're a parliamentary system. And we're also a country, if you'll allow me to say this, full of Jews, which means when you give Jews not 1 vote, but 2 votes, and you think they're going to cast both votes for the same party, you don't know about Israeli culture. So when we gave them 2 votes, what they automatically did was they split their vote. They voted for the prime minister, and then they shattered the Israeli party system into fragmented, fractured little parties. It simply didn't work. After Netanyahu was elected in 96 and Barak in 99, quickly all the parties on the right and on the left realized this isn't working. And the minute Sharon was elected in 2001, we canceled that and went back to the old system, realizing, you know, the devil we knew is better than the experiment that we tried and failed.
Okay, fair enough. The next question, is Naftali Bennett gaining or losing support with his move to generate a new party?
Well, the answer is it depends. If you look at the elections in 2015, the Jewish Home had 8 seats. If you look today at the Jewish Home and the New Right, which is Bennett's new party, 7 plus 5 is 12. That would appear that he's gaining votes. From 8 to 12 is a 50% increase. But if you go back one more election, not to 2015, but to 2013, the Jewish Home had 12 seats. So he's basically, over time, brought back simply the voters that he lost in the last election. Is this doing him any good? I honestly don't know. But I don't think that what Bennett is looking for is to gain more votes. What Bennett wants to do is be prime minister. And he realized that in a party that is somewhere between 8 to 12 seats, he's not going to be prime minister. So he split from the Jewish Home, created a new party that tries to place itself closer to the Likud. And what he would really like to do, and I'm speaking not for him, but sort of psychoanalyzing him, is if the Attorney General decides to prosecute Netanyahu and Netanyahu is forced to resign, there will be a leadership battle in the Likud to replace Netanyahu. Bennett will then take his party merge with Likud and join that leadership battle. His sights are not set on gaining 2 or 3 more seats in the parliament. They're set on merging with Likud, challenging for the leadership, and hopefully becoming the leader of the party and the next prime minister, something he knew he couldn't do in a smaller fringe party.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. The next one, assuming that the center parties are asked to form a government and they do form a government, what difference in policies do you see being put into place?
That's a very good question, and the answer is it depends on what government they form. Because if you look at the current numbers now, mathematically, you can take the 2 center parties, you can take the 2 dovish parties, and you can take the Arab parties, and you have a majority. But ideologically, that is completely impossible, because the Arab parties are considered to be so far to the left. They are the fringe. Nobody wants to govern with them because it is perceived that their interests are the Palestinian interests and not those of the voters in Israel. So the minute you take those 13 seats away, there's no majority for the center plus the Dubs. So the center is going to have to go elsewhere. Where could they go? The minute they try to bring in religious parties, they're going to start losing some of the dovish parties who are not in favor of religion. The minute they start bringing in some of the hawkish parties, and this morning in Israel, the 3 smaller hawkish parties announced that they will not sit in a government with the center. But suppose they do, the Labour Party and Meretz will pull out, not sitting with the extreme right. In other words, mathematically it's possible. Politically, ideologically, it's practically impossible. The only way I can see the center governing is if Likud cannot form a government, blue and white cannot form a government, and they come together, what we call a national unity government. In that case, Likud is still around as the major or second largest party, and we won't have too much of a change in policies.
Okay, and the last question, and this is for those of us who are probably a little bit more unfamiliar with Israeli politics. Does the Israeli president have any political significance, and what is the purpose of the presidential role within the Israeli political system?
Okay, the Israeli president has absolutely no role whatsoever. Anyone who says different doesn't understand the law in Israel. The Israeli president is not elected by the people. He is a ceremonial figure. He is chosen by the Israeli parliament for a 7-year term, after which he cannot be reelected, and usually they retire and go off and do whatever they want after that. The Israeli president plays a role after the elections that is written in the law, and he cannot diverge from it. And the role is based on the following. He will invite the leaders of all the parties that won seats in the April 9th election. In other words, when you look at this chart, he's got about 10 to 12 different party leaders that he needs to invite. He asks them a question written in the law, and the question is, which party is most likely to be able to form a majority? This is a transparent process because the party leaders then leave and hold a press conference and tell us exactly what they told the president. After this process, the president invites one party leader back, which most party leaders pointed out, and simply asks them to try and form a government. He has no ability to choose who he wants. He has to decide based on what the politicians told him and based on the election results in Israel. In other words, he is a dignified, ceremonial, unifying person who walks through the political process on eggshells and tries not to do anything that will inflame anyone after we've just fought a very contentious election.
Okay. We'll try and do 2 more quick questions, and then we'll have to close out, so apologies if we don't get to yours. What is the possibility of Israel raising the threshold for the Knesset to reduce the number of parties and force greater compromise within the parties?
Okay, the threshold in Israel was already raised in the 2015 elections. It is now at 3.25%. And what you can see in this chart and in the one before, which was the 2015 election results, is that we don't have any tiny parties, no parties with 1 or 2 seats. It's very difficult to get in with 3. You basically need 4 seats with a threshold of 3.25%. If you look out across the democratic world, most parliamentary systems are somewhere between 3 and 4%. So we are right there already. The minute you go beyond that, you get to one country, Germany, at 5%. And Germany has the history of the Weimar Republic, and they have a reason for being so high. And by the way, that reason isn't working anymore because in the last elections, the Nazis were elected into the German parliament again. The minute you pass 5%, you get to countries that are not democratic anymore. Russia has a 7% threshold. Turkey has a 10% threshold. In other words, the minute you start disenfranchising large parts of the population, you're putting democracy in question in your country. So Israel is about as far as it could go. We could play with it. It could go from 3.25% to 4%. We might want to even match Germany at 5%. That's not going to change much. We've maxed out on this tool.
Okay. And the final question, with Trump's promise to fix the Israeli-Palestinian issue via Jared Kushner, what is being shared by his administration with or within Israel, and how does Israel feel about it?
I really can't answer that because I don't know what is being shared. From what we hear in Israel, elements are being shared, but not all of it. So we do not have a peace plan. We do not know what kind of groundwork has been done, not just with Israel, but with the Arab partners in order to move this forward. The ambassador would be able to answer this question a lot better than me, but any peace plan that is simply announced in Washington is worth about the paper that it's printed on. You need a lot of good work, groundwork, preparatory work in the Middle East. And today, regretfully, the Trump administration doesn't have the ability to do that kind of work amongst many of the partners that we would need at the negotiating table, starting with the Palestinians. So I'm not holding my breath for the Trump peace plan for the Middle East. I'm sure you'll build a wall long before we have a peace plan that goes anywhere.
All right. Thank you, Professor Hazan, for an incredibly enlightening presentation. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us as well. We're very grateful and appreciative to have you both. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And again, to learn how you can get more involved, please email alumni@afhu.org and visit afhu.org. We look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.